Before we get into questions and comments and answers, I'd like to finish reading the last part of Admiral Herring's letter. It goes like this. I have discussed most of these issues with the NRC's Inspector General's office, but to date, I've heard or seen nothing of consequence. Regulations are, in my business, written to be followed and not waived. Our investigation and experience over the course of the last 2 years have shown that this is not the way our nuclear industry operates. If you cannot comply, ask for a waiver, and it will probably be granted. And chances are there is no compliance requirement date set for them to attain full compliance. I believe the most important issue, and the reason this gathering became so important, is that when many of the issues were brought to the Community Engagement Panel, an organization established to address citizens' concerns, they were in a similar fashion dismissed, or the message provided to the concerned citizens echoed the message of the Utilities Public Affairs Department, or were dismissed as already addressed. I'm sorry this has become such a concern, but the truth is the system is broken and those involved have a lot to answer for. Take the time today to listen and ask yourself if these questions had been properly addressed and our concerns satisfied, would any of this be necessary? Respectfully, Admiral Onofre Herring. Okay, we have an enormous number of questions and some terrific comments. The first question is, in the past, this is from Catherine, have you considered nuclear energy to be a safe source of energy? Should it be considered as an alternative to the use of fossil fuel to reduce climate change? I think you're going to get many different answers on that one, Catherine. So I'd like to start with Kathy Iwani. Is nuclear energy a safe source of energy?
Well, in my opinion, I experienced the most unsafe of the nuclear bad playbook play out in real time. And it's interesting, you know, I did see another question that relates exactly to this question. And I'd like to bring up a very interesting professor at USC, Dr. Najmedi Meshkati. And he was actually, he's written extensively. So his last name is Meshkati, Meshkati. He's written extensively on safety culture and how oftentimes systems of people, safety regulations, safety culture of the workers at a certain plant can be thoroughly engaged, thoroughly followed with a really good teamwork. Now, I did see another question in the questions today, and it was it alluded to the fact that, believe it or not, up the northeast coast from the Fukushima plant, there were in effect larger tsunami waves. And yet I don't remember the name of this plant, but it was the plant escaped unscathed. They were able to shut down all systems. They were able to see what was coming, and they got through the earthquake and the tsunami unscathed. So to me, Dr. Najmedi Meshkati has been to Japan. He's been a consultant after the Fukushima tragedy. And I think it just getting back to whether nuclear is a good energy or not, it's as long as we have human error, and that's what causes nuclear issues to go critical. There are not enough safety mechanisms in place. In my opinion, it's not the best way to go. But you're asking the wrong person, I think. Paul.
Okay, our next question is from Dwight.
Now, Charles, I would like to just add to Kathy's response.
Briefly, please.
Oh, having seen safe nuclear power plants and unsafe nuclear power plants, and recognizing we live in a capitalistic economy, the Navy plants are safe. There's no, in my mind, and safety is just a perception anyway. And I transitioned from the Navy to the commercial and just could not believe the difference in everything with respect to safety. The commercial plants can be made safe. The problem is if they ever made them safe, like the Navy nuclear power plants, the cost of construction and design would not be competitive with any other form of energy. That is the main reason we don't have safe nuclear power plants. The Navy has no real concern about budget. Their concern is reliability and safety. The concern of the commercial plants is simply dollars, and they will do anything to increase that bottom line. Thank you.
I'd like to add just one quick comment if I could. I know it's short on time, but until we have a solution for nuclear waste, we shouldn't even be talking about using more nuclear power. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a great question. Please describe what a hot cell facility is and if it would be helpful at songs.
You want me to try that, or?
How about you, Paul?
Yeah, a hot cell facility has been used at various reprocessing facilities throughout the world. They're very expensive. I would estimate they're in the range of $1 billion, but they've got to be capable of dealing with that 6-foot diameter, 24-foot high cast. It's never been done. I'm not sure how a hot cell facility could be constructed for a reasonable cost. It's probably going to approach $1 billion, and it's a research project, and it's going to take a long time to do it. It can be done on a small scale, but doing it on a large scale is extremely difficult. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of research and development.
Great, thank you. I have two questions now for Gary. This is from Ray. It says, according to the newspaper Coast News, the protective seawall at San Onofre is 28 feet versus the 14-foot wall shown in your slide. Can you comment on that? And then we've got a second question from Jerry that says, with the failure of Yucca Mountain, do the panelists feel there is any possibility of the US approving a safe, high-level nuclear waste depository similar to that of the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant in Finland?
Well, you want me to take that on?
I do.
I wanted to just briefly touch on what Paul said too. There's examples of hot cells in other parts of the world that are functioning well, and we could copy and even improve on what they've done, like this Willag facility in Switzerland. But so now I've lost track of the question you asked originally. Help me out there, Charles.
Sure. With the failure of Yucca Mountain, do you feel there's any possibility of the US approving a safe, high-level nuclear waste depository similar to the one in Finland? And that was addressed to the whole panel, as well as you.
Well, I'll just quickly say that Finland's doing the first deep geological project, and it's about to get started. And even that is an unproven situation. So if we can take the first steps, we can worry about the rest later. But the first step is to repackage the canisters into thick casks and keep them in bunkers above ground. And we'll refine the process for a permanent solution. But right now, we've got to get to that step before these thin canisters start to fail.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add to that a little bit, Charles. And you know, we've seen everyone, you know, Department of Energy is funding a study, going around looking for volunteers to take all this junk. You know, it's nice and thought, and it was done in Finland. And there are people in the political environment that's very different in Finland than it is here. There's not the same fear in Finland of nuclear that we have here in the United States. And you may see communities that are willing to take the waste. And it's what I call the donut hole effect. Those communities in the immediate area will say yes, just like they did at Yucca Mountain. But outside that donut hole, the rest of the donut says, I don't want this in my state. And that's exactly what happened, because right inside that hole, there's a lot of money and a lot of work, and they support it. But the people in the surrounding areas, I just am not optimistic at all they're ever going to find anyone to agree for a high-level waste disposal site in the United States.
I'd like to say too that I think part of the reason that this discussion in a way has been refused to have been made by the NRC in a public realm, and also by Southern California's CEP, Southern California Edison CEP, is that there are solutions happening in other countries, and they're very, very expensive. Now, when we talk about a permanent repository, that is a solution that has not been found anywhere in the world to be 100% foolproof, effective, going to happen, airtight. It's a sure thing. The one thing we do know that's happening in other countries is that they have enclosed hardened bunkers with thick-walled casks that have escaped the ravages of Fukushima. It's happening in Switzerland, it's happening in Japan, and it's also happening in Germany. So it's time to stop kicking the can, pun intended, down the road and secure the waste on site to the best of our very, very wealthy country's ability. If other countries can do it, it's time to talk about doing it in our country. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Sarah. And it says, can you make the Gerald Kuhn article titled Paleoseismic Features available to everyone? And I'd like to answer yes. We'll make sure that that's on the website at grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre, and hopefully we can get that up for you tomorrow. There's a comment from Catherine Johnson and kind of an open-ended question. It says, it seems as if you're only talking about San Onofre. What about other nuclear facilities such as Diablo Canyon in Northern California? Is it also a danger as it is being considered for reactivation? Since Japan has only 30% of their energy provided by hydroelectric, what is your recommendation for Japan, fossil fuel or nuclear? I'd like to answer part of that, and I think it's sort of beyond the capacity of this group to make energy recommendations for Japan. But Paul, maybe you could address what it is about the other facilities such as Diablo Canyon. And do you think there's a danger in reactivation, or should they proceed with shutting it down?
Well, I'm not in favor of continued, not with the present regulatory environment and failure to enforce regulations. I certainly would not endorse restart of or continued operation of Diablo Canyon for a number of reasons. Let's talk about the waste first. Now, at Diablo Canyon, I've seen pictures. I don't think there's a problem of a tsunami impacting the nuclear waste there because it's at a quite high elevation. But the problem is with San Onofre continuing to produce more waste every day, we're just going to add to that burden for future generations, and we have no solution, and we won't have a solution for a long time. We don't even have the ability to transport this at this time. So I would not support the continued generation of nuclear waste until we have a solution as to what we can do with it.
Okay, now here's another question for you, Paul. At what canister temperature will the canisters buckle? Will the middle buckle outward or inward at the middle? At what temperature would it rupture, and what would happen if it ruptures?
Okay, all I can say is, first of all, I'm not a metallurgist, and whether it would buckle in the middle or not. As far as rupture goes, we don't have the data. It's never been tested. Again, the NRC has stated in writing it's not credible. Certainly, it's going to rupture if you ever get a criticality. I would suspect that we're going to have leakage due to the thermal shock. Now, everyone says, what's the motive force for forcing that is out the radioactive material out? Well, if you remember, the outside of the cask, if you have a rupture, is going to be probably 800 degrees, and water comes in, hits that, it's going to flash the steam, not only on the outside of the canister, but on the inside of the canister. There is your motive force for dispersing this radioactive material out to some unknown area. Another thing that needs to be addressed in the analysis.
That's great. Here's a question for Kathy from James Heddle. I believe there is another nuclear plant along Japan's coast that experienced an even higher tsunami wave than Daiichi, but was able to safely shut down because they heeded the warnings. If you know this to be true, what lessons can we draw from this? And I guess it's Mary Beth.
Yeah.
Franklin.
That was the one that I was just referring to, and I'm sorry. Yes, it was Mary Beth's question. What I believe, and I've learned from Dr. Meshkati, his first name is Najmedi Meshkati. He's an engineer, and he's also a graduate school professor of nuclear matters at USC. And I've spoken to him at length on the phone, and he's written he's published several articles on safety culture. And he was also a consultant to the, everyone says that Japan had a regulator. It was kind of like nuclear industry regulation. It was literally after the Fukushima accident that they decided to get a regulator going. And so Dr. Mishkati was part of setting that up. He was a consultant going to and from LA to Fukushima and to Tokyo to set that up with the government. But what his publications allude to is the fact that that plant, and I can't, someone probably on this very call, Paul, do you know the name of the plant that was, it's up the coast?
Not off the top of my head, no.
And I had it in my notes, but it's up the coast northeast from Fukushima. They escaped. Their actual tsunami waves were much bigger due to the geographical coastline, all sorts of underwater formations, etc. And why is it that they escaped unscathed from the same tragedy? Well, that goes back to safety culture, and they had everything followed. There was no sleeping at the wheel. There was no human error. And so in answer to Mary Beth's question, yes, I do know that to be true. And I wish that there was more light shown on that. But you all that are remaining on this call, God bless you all. Please refer to Dr. Mishkati at USC. He's written on safety culture, and we are clearly lacking that at San Onofre. Human error is the reason we need safety culture. Thank you.
Here's a question from Beth Leeds, a very prominent activist. And she says, at the last meeting with NRC several years ago, Scott Morris promised another meeting. Scott Morris is one of the top executives at the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Because of the information presented today, she asks, I am calling for an emergency meeting in San Juan within 2 weeks. So I guess that's San Onofre. So I'll tell you what, Ms. Leeds, I will personally write a letter to Scott Morris requesting that, and I'll copy it to you. So you'll also have his email address. The next question is for Kathy and Paul from Nancy Wolf. It says, super impressed with this presentation. Did you get any sense of specific steps that must be taken to support San Onofre through climate storms and other issues like earthquakes? What rights do we have to force the issue?
Well, as far as rights to force the issue, that it's very difficult to, and we have taken through the state of New York litigation against the NRC, and even $30 million that we spent, we still didn't win. They protect themselves. The judges are appointed by the NRC. Litigation is extremely difficult. The only thing we can do is hope and pray that the people, that we can get a public outcry that we will not tolerate the danger and the irresponsible lack of regulation enforcement, and we need to do something. A legal challenge is we just don't have the funds to do that, and I'm not sure the worthwhileness of such an effort, but it's public pressure. That's the only thing that will ever get these people to change. And, you know, I looked at the attendance list, and there are some high-level NRC people listening in, but we'll make sure that a copy of this gets to the appropriate people in the NRC and the Inspector General's office and the chairman, and hopefully your congressmen and so on and so forth out there. But we need a public outcry. It deserves it. When you put people in danger, and we don't know what that probability is, except I wouldn't feel comfortable with having my grandchildren out there. We need a public outcry. We need people to write letters to the editor, whatever you have to do, saying, hey, government, you need to do something.
I'd like to add to that, and perhaps after I give my idea on what we can do to force change, Paul might want in his own way to describe, in what ways have you engaged with the NRC? But before you talk about that, I'd like to sort of, in the way of forcing change, it takes, change is never going to come from the people making the decisions based on cost analysis. It's going to come from what's necessary, and it's going to come from grassroots. So with that in mind, you'll hear shortly probably from Paul, but in January of 2020, Paul and public watchdogs went ahead to the NRC, and they had a 2.206 petition process. Well, I've been following this. I became a big fan of Paul, and I became a big fan of what public watchdogs had set out to do. And what I decided to do was take the concerns that Paul has shared tonight, and I knew, because there are elected individuals that are sitting on the board of the community engagement panel at Southern Cal Edison, and I said, hey, why don't we have tonight's conversation? Let's reinvigorate that kind of meeting, because literally no one was showing up. Why don't we have Paul present to the CEP? And knowing that the community engagement panel had a fabulous charter, that charter purports to commit to public dialogue and commit to the community's input on decommissioning concerns at San Onofre. So what we did is I requested last December, it was a heavily endorsed letter. There are some of the people that endorsed this letter. We had city council members of local city councils, we had mayors, we had documentarians, we had scientists, and we had community leaders and researchers. And they heavily endorsed my request to Southern Cal Edison, hey, let's have an open conversation about this. Well, lo and behold, the CEP came back to me and they said, sorry, we can't do that. And they essentially parroted the NRC speaking points, saying that, hey, your concerns are not valid. We've already addressed this. And essentially, what you're worried about is not credible. However, in actuality, what really was happening was that there was no proof, no studies, no risk assessment, or any assurance that the equipment was on site and the training of workers was to such a level that they could avert a crisis or a catastrophe at San Onofre in the case of a flood or a tsunami. So here we are, having this conversation, and this is exactly what, getting back to that fabulous question, how do you force change? It's about getting experts together, the technical, the political, the economics, all of it together to put that puzzle together and have these uncomfortable, very cost informing conversations. Paul, perhaps you'd like to speak about your history with
Really
the
like
NRC.
that. You just alluded to what has been our contact and what have our efforts been, and I always document what I say, and I just briefly want to say that we have filed 2 formal petitions per CFR. They were not even accepted, and basically they said, and one of them was on flooding. We've already addressed this issue, so we're not going to continue. We're not going to consider your petition. But then I elevated it along with Charles to I'd also had some input from one of the commissioner's offices who, why don't you ask for a public meeting as per the commission policy? So I took that commission policy, went to the top guy in the NRC staff, the executive director for operations, Dan Dorman, and I requested a public meeting for their policy. And he essentially gave me the middle finger and said no. So I then elevated it to the commission, the chairman of the commission appointed by the president, and asked the commission to direct the technical staff to conduct a public meeting as provided for in our policy. And the chairman wrote back to me and said, hey, how about a private meeting? So we had a private meeting on May 17th last year. Kathy, you were in attendance, Admiral Herring and Charles was in attendance. And we had a very cordial meeting with the chairman, and Kathy documented it very well. And it clearly stated that we request you direct the staff to have a public meeting. No response from the chairman. 3 months later, I said, where's your response? Still no response. The NRC does not want to communicate with me, but I've had a little bit, I've got my foot in the door in another way, and there's still a little hope. But we've got the Inspector General who does not directly report to the commission. He reports to Congress. We've also had a Zoom conversation with another presidential appointee. So we've made every conceivable effort to sit down and talk, just like Biden and McCarthy are now talking. We need to talk. You can't do it through letters and throw stones at one another. We don't want to do that. We want to have a civil conversation based on technical and regulatory issues.
Thank you. Here's a comment from, I hope I'm saying this right, Mikkel Lee. It says, a note should be made about the absurdity of mitigating an event at songs caused by a catastrophic earthquake or tsunami. Most of the infrastructure, roads, electric power, and communications would be badly damaged. Unlike Fukushima and Chernobyl, Songs is in a highly demographically concentrated region. I see you nodding to that, Kathy. Do you want to comment?
Well, I'd just like to say that in Fukushima, you had 300,000 people evacuate. And let me tell you, it's God's country up there. It is country, it's provincial. There's no one that lives there. And thank God, half of that radioactivity went out to sea. What we're talking about at San Onofre, within a 50-mile radius, is over I think it's 8.5 million people. And I'll be the first to say, I moved here 12 years ago, and Highway 5 is not what it was 12 years ago. 12 years ago, yeah, maybe you had terrible traffic jams, but this is turning into LA light here. And it's one of I think it's the third largest economic trade corridors in the United States, coming in and out of the what is it? I don't want to say harbor, but the trade area of Long Beach. And so if we're looking at not only treasure, human lives, environment, you are looking at a large swath of agriculture, industry. The white paper on this, something like $13 trillion would be affected economically. And if you can look at those numbers, that's what people look at. They don't, apparently our regulators and Coastal Commission, et cetera, they're not looking at the failed reef as a result of the radionuclides being dumped into the ocean since 1969. I don't want to get into that now. That's for another webinar. However, when it comes down to economics, we need to look at this. People have homes, they have businesses. This is a highly, in Michelle's astute comment, highly concentrated population.
I'd like to add a little bit, the identified person is Michelle Lee, who resides in the Indian Point area in New York, and both Kathy and I know her and respect her very much. But if you look at Fukushima and the evacuation does not make people safe. A lot of people were killed or died as a result of the evacuation in a relatively low population zone. We have people in nursing homes, we have sick people that cannot be evacuated. I saw numbers of 1,500 people died because of the evacuation. We got to look at that very carefully. Evacuation, by the way, in San Onofre is impossible. It cannot help or happen. So thank you, Michelle, for your comments, and we'll be talking.
Okay, here's a couple comments. This one's from Mike Eppenetter. Thank you all for your support. If not for your efforts, we would be toast, ... And this is from Liz Shear and David Jewell. And it says, this is terrific. Thank you, heroines and heroes. And we have a question, a lot of questions along this line. And Gary, maybe you could take a shot at answering this. People are asking, do we need to reopen the conversation about Yucca Mountain? What happened to Yucca Mountain, and why can't we put stuff in Yucca Mountain?
Well, Yucca Mountain is an interesting story. It's kind of a good example of what fails, and that's why we're going for a consent-based siting if we do find a place to have a permanent solution. But besides the politics and geology being such a struggle, the fact is now we've created so much more waste that even if Yucca Mountain performed as expected, we'd still have to build another one. We don't have enough space for all the nuclear waste, especially what we continue to produce.
Okay, here's a comment from Beth that says, quotes Einstein saying it's the worst way to heat water. And a question from Danny Brown. What can we do to push Edison to make a chance and move faster? Is there a specific person? What is step one to get things moving in this process? Wow, that's a really great question. And there's no easy answer.
Well, I'll throw something in there just
Okay.
because it's already in progress. We're working hard to develop a strategy paper, and by we, there's some people not involved in this particular event, but a lot of progress being made, and not focusing so much on what's wrong with the nuclear systems that are in contention, but what are we proposing to do? What do we think is a reasonable solution so that we can all get behind it, have workshops, talk about the real facts of the matter, and come up with something that is universally acceptable as much as possible. But until we get a consensus of some kind, our messaging is just going to be all over the place. So I'm excited about what's just around the corner, and it's the beginning of a discussion that will hopefully give us the results that we want, a reasonable solution to this just unacceptable situation.
That's great.
I would like to just make a brief comment on some numbers about what Gary said. Yucca Mountain was initially conceived based on 77,000 tons of nuclear waste. We already have over 110,000 tons of nuclear waste. So what Gary said was 100%. Even if we got Yucca Mountain and everything there today, we wouldn't end the problem. We need another waste site. So the problem is huge, and certainly I do not have a solution, but we need to discuss potential solutions, realistic solutions, and it's going to be very, very difficult.
Okay, and Danny's asking, what can we do to move faster? And is there a specific person we can target? What is step one to get things moving in this process? I'd like to respond. Public Watchdogs has exhausted almost every legal remedy available for forcing Edison to move the nuclear waste. We fought a case all the way to the Supreme Court. It was rejected. We took it to the highest court in California. They declined to rule in our favor or hear it. And Paul Blanche and Public Watchdogs have filed multiple petitions to revoke before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is literally a request to revoke Edison's permit and privilege to bury nuclear waste on the beach. So Danny's asking, is there a specific step we can do to get things moving? Does anyone have a simple answer for this?
Let me just try that. I think the first step is with the NRC, and a colleague of more than 30 years has now been put into a position reporting directly to the commission. And she and I had a conversation last Friday evening, and at least I got my foot in the door, and I'm hoping that we can pursue that route through the professional relationship this person and I have with one another, and she reports right to the commission. So I'm going to work on pursuing that. Cautiously optimistic, but at least we've got our foot in the door, and we can give it a try.
Okay. Here's a comment from Kathy Moore. So maybe the only solution is to have the government be the only one to own and operate these plants as nonprofits, in parens, provided the waste can be dealt with responsibly and permanently, of course. Take it out of the free market system. I can comment on that if no one else wants to.
I can too.
Okay, well, the nuclear waste is the property of the nuclear power plant until the United States government accepts it. And the problem is there's no way the United States government can accept this nuclear waste because no one's been able to figure out where to put it. Nobody wants this stuff. So it's basically a stalemate. As far as operating these nuclear power plants as nonprofits, the one thing that we know can get a company like Edison motivated is a profit motive. And getting them to spend money from the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund is a great way for them to actually make money creating improvements. So there's an opportunity there, but I don't think it's possible to operate this as a nonprofit because it would just be giving Edison a free pass for having created a horrific problem.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I know I'm making too many comments, but if we look at government taking over responsibility for nuclear waste, just look around at Rocky Flats, Hanford, Savannah River, West Valley, every nuclear site operated by the government has turned into an absolute disaster. I would rather trust Southern Cal Edison before I trust the Department of Energy or any other government agency to handle and be responsible for our nuclear waste.
Okay. Here's a comment and I think a question from Ace Hoffman. Please note that the Navy's used reactors are extremely hazardous, much more so than commercial spent fuel. And America has over 130 used nuclear Navy reactors already, with another 80 still in submarines. There's no solution to the Navy waste either. And then he also said later on, correction, 132 from submarines, plus reactors from 9 cruisers, 2 each and 1 carrier, 8 cores. What do you think, Paul? You're a former Navy guy.
Yeah, I know. A lot of this is classified information, but what I do know, and I've actually participated in the refueling of 2 Navy nuclear reactors, and you got to recognize these cores are not much bigger than a 55-gallon drum, and the Navy has the ability to operate under classified security and all kinds of cover. So what we did, both in Hartford here with a reactor and also down in New London, is they would take the whole reactor out, and essentially put it in a water-cooled cask, and they would put it on a truck and not tell anyone where it's going, and they would ship it out to Idaho Falls, Idaho. Details of what they're doing out there, I would assume they're sitting in spent fuel pools for cooling, but we can't get a lot of information. But they have the ability to transport this stuff cross country, and they've done it. My old reactors are out there from the Patrick Henry and the Stonewall Jackson, and they do it under government security, and we never know whether that truck that goes by our front door is carrying nuclear, high-level nuclear waste. And by the way, the nuclear waste from the Navy is a whole lot more radioactive than what we've seen. Physically, much smaller. So, we would take probably 70 some trucks from San Onofre, where the Navy could take a whole submarine reactor and ship it on 1 rail car or 1 truck without ever telling anyone. So that's the way the government does it. And they've done it safely.
Here's one from Bart Ziegler that I'd like to answer, and anyone else can join in. It says, is the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, captured by the industry, as was the Federal Aviation Administration when the Boeing 737s were having problems? Bart, I think the only answer to that is yes, it is a captured regulatory agency, and it's far worse than the FAA. In my perception is that essentially the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gets its marching orders from the industry, and that it's controlled by the industry that it's supposed to regulate, and it's a real problem. Does anyone else want to say anything about this?
I'd just like to say that we're at 736, first of all, but in addition to the fact that the NRC is funded to the tune of, what I've seen, 89% of all licensees. That means nuclear power plants are funding the NRC. Now, how do you have a regulator that is supposed to regulate when its paycheck depends on who they're regulating? So that would be perhaps something for this group to think about, to increase the awareness of how to enforce action. I personally think that when we get experts together and we get the right experts together, bringing youth, energized, engaged youth into this movement,
I object.
There's nothing. There's and the elders and the activists and everyone, increase the knowledge base. There's nothing we can't do.
Okay, here's one that's a reasonable question. Could a dedicated rail system be constructed from songs inland that would either go under or over the 101 and take the waste to a bunker drilled into the hills that are owned by the Navy/government? It might be less expensive than building a bunker right next to the ocean, and it would eradicate threats from tsunami and saltwater. Now, I think that sounds like a tremendously common sense solution. Would anyone like to comment on why that isn't happening? Then I will.
Look at, please.
Moving any nuclear waste off of San Onofre across that site boundary would literally require an act of Congress. And then it would be tied up in courts for years in all sorts of lawsuits that would try to prevent it from being taken from San Onofre to another repository, which, as we've discussed earlier, doesn't exist. There's no such thing at this time. So the general consensus is that any kind of an effort to move that nuclear waste is going to be so tied up in the court system that it would involve literally lifetimes of litigation. So we need probably an act of Congress to do it. And even that would make it very difficult.
I agree with Charles.
Let's see. Okay, I think it's time to wrap this up. I thank you all for listening carefully and asking such great questions. If I can remind you that you can go to the website for this seminar, grassrootsinfo.org/San Onofre, and we've got all sorts of great information there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gary, Kathy, Paul, and I'd especially like to thank Doug Wood for doing a tremendous amount of work at grassrootsinfo.org and making this whole presentation possible on a technological level and on a scheduling level, and doing all the other stuff that you've done to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, too.
Okay. Good night.
Yes, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Charles,
everyone.
Doug, and everyone for participating and assisting us. This was a monumental task, and we all did it with our own time and effort. And thank you, everybody, for doing this for us.